So I want to talk about what I thought would be the last verses of this morning's Torah reading. Exodus chapter 15, verse 20, the second to last verse of the Song of the Sea. It's one of my favorites in the entire Torah. Then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her in dance with timbrels. For all the time and energy we spend poring over the text of the Torah, for all the lessons and wisdom we glean from its words, there are really very few moments of unadulterated joy. Reading this verse or listening to this verse, I get a clear picture of Miriam, unable to bottle up her own joy and excitement. She doesn't lead the people by the word of God like her brothers, but instead she leads the people by her own emotion and enthusiasm and example. There's also a very famous midrashic question on this verse. Where exactly did Miriam and the women get timbrels? Weren't they just hightailing it out of Egypt? The Midrash explains, pretty simply, in fact, that the women had faith, and they knew that God would lead them miraculously from the hands of the Egyptians. And so, even though the dough on their backs didn't have time to rise before it turned into matzah, when they were getting ready to leave, they made sure to grab their timbrels, so that when the time came, even if they wouldn't have what to eat, they would be prepared to properly celebrate. Much like the Israelites walking through the seabed, we find ourselves in our own moment of transition. The Israelites, I imagine, could see the opposite bank on the far end of the Reed Sea and the freedom it represented. Yet they looked back and they knew that the Egyptians were still hot on their tails. We can finally see the light at the end of the COVID tunnel ahead of us. And yet we know the looming threat the virus represents is still flaring up behind us and around us, as prepared as we are to leave it in the dust. One of the verses from Hallel this morning, even though we didn't sing it together, speaks directly to what it is like to exist in this space of difficult transition. Min hametzar karati ya, anani bamerchavya. From the narrow straits, I called out to God. God answered me with wide open space. The path through the split sea, with the walls of water rising up dramatically on either side, is a narrow strait in itself. Yet it makes the open space on the far shore seem infinitely more expansive. Yizkor, particularly this morning at the end of Pesach, can feel like its own moment of narrowness. As of now, this is the longest we go in the Jewish calendar without a liturgical opportunity for remembrance. It's been about 6 months since we last said Yizkor on the final day of Sukkot. And we gather this morning less than a week before Yom HaShoah, and the deep national sense of loss and pain that Holocaust remembrance engenders, and less than a week after the Seders, the time when so many of us remember our own moments of spontaneous joy and song and celebration with people who have sat around our Seder tables. Combine all that with the loss we have been processing over the last year, not just the tremendous loss of life, but also the loss of normalcy and routine, and of close human connection. And it can feel like grief is looming over us, like two towering walls of water. Even though our goal in this morning's Yizkor service might not explicitly be celebration, I still think we can learn from Miriam and her song. and her own process of leading the Israelites to be prepared for what came next. Ellen Frankel, in her Torah commentary, The 5 Books of Miriam, wonders about the relative length of Miriam's song at the sea compared to Moses. And maybe instead of relative length, the key verse would be relative brevity. She posits that this is likely an editorial decision, and that the one line of Miriam's song that is in the text is actually just a brief excerpt of the whole. And she also writes that Miriam's song, though so brief, today stirs the heart of the Jewish people, especially women, inspiring them to create new songs, poems, stories, meditations, interpretive commentaries, and prayers. The Rumi poem with which we began services this morning reminded us to be grateful and welcoming for whatever emotional guests come to us, not knowing where they will lead us. There's an incredible amount of meaning and inspiration to be found from the most difficult of circumstances. Miriam walked through the split sea and led the people in a line of joy that has inspired us for generations. We have our own opportunity this morning to bring all of our own emotional guests to our experience of Yizkor, of remembering, contextualizing, and connecting to the memories of our loved ones. Everything that is stirring in our hearts this moment, let's head into Yizkor and use that to create our own loving songs, poems, stories, and prayers, and honor our loved ones with them. In the words of Rabbi Joshua Loth Liebman, the melody that the loved one played upon the piano of our life will never be played quite that way again. But we must not close the keyboard and allow the instrument to gather dust. We must seek out other artists of the spirit, new friends who gradually will help us to find the road to life, who will walk that road with us. Or this morning, friends who will help us find our own timbrels and walk or dance out of the narrow straits.